Okay, I think we're good to get started. Hopefully you can all hear me. First and foremost, I'd like to welcome you all to this online consultation event for the UK Woodland Assurance Standard. I'm Owen Davis from FSC UK. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome so many of you for what I'm pretty sure is the first time we've ever done such an online consultation event during an UKWAS revision process. So this is new for us. We hope it'll prove to be a worthwhile exercise. We'll certainly seek your views before the end. I'd like to make it clear from the start that although I'm here representing FSC UK and FSC UK is hosting this event, it's very much about UKWAS as an independent certification standard. And I'm delighted that Alan Watkins from PEFC UK is also on this call and may be able to answer some of your questions later. But yeah, without further ado, I will take you through our agenda. Quite a simple agenda for the day. I'll get my bits out of the way quite quickly. The main thing is to give Peter Wilson, who is the independent chair of the UKWAS working group, an opportunity to talk to you about the revision process so far and a summary of proposed changes to UKWAS. We'll then have a question and answer session, which I hope will be roughly an hour long. And then we'll have a few closing messages, mostly just to encourage you to respond formally to the currently open UKWAS consultation. Not too many housekeeping issues to worry about, I don't think. I'm not quite sure what you can see on your screen. On my screen, certainly all the various tools are on the right-hand side. There should be an area there for handouts. So if you haven't had an opportunity to look at the consultation documentation, there's an option there to download PDFs of both the consultation paper and the current draft of UKWAS. There's nothing very exciting in my slides, but there's quite a lot of detail in Peter's slides. We will share those in PDF form with you afterwards, so don't worry about taking too many notes or screenshots of that. We're recording right now. We're going to record the presentation, but we won't be recording the question and answer session afterwards. Just to make this easier to manage, we're going to ask people to provide questions in written form. So you should hopefully, in around about the same place, you can find the handouts on your screen. There should also be an area for you to enter your questions. We're not going to interrupt Peter's flow while he's talking. We're going to deal with all the questions later on. But if you could just type questions as you occur to them, as they occur to you, sorry, we will then pick them up in order later. Peter obviously will be answering some of the questions. If there's any questions I can answer or Alan can answer, we can do so. And there should also be a couple of members of the UKWAS working group on this call. I can see that Andy Sharkey from the Woodland Trust has joined. I'm hoping for at least one other member of the working group to join as well. So there'll be a few people who can potentially answer your questions. And yeah, although we're going to try to do everything in written form, if there are any questions that require clarification, we will unmute you if necessary. But that is it from me, and I am going to hand over to Peter.
Thank you very much indeed, Owen, and hello to everyone. First off, apologies if you hear any tapping, but my neighbours upstairs are having some extensive renovations done, and there's been quite a lot of tapping, but they've promised not to tap above my study for the duration of the afternoon. Yeah, Owen, if you can go to the next slide. So this is just the shape of what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. So it's a quick briefing. So some of you will know everything there is to know about UKWAS. Some of you, it might be a bit of a blur, and for others, you might not know very much about it at all. So we'll have a quick canter through that one. We'll then look at the review and the revision process and the timetable for the entire process up until hopefully the launch of the new standard. And then we can look at some of the issues which have been addressed by the working group so far in the initial revision draft, which I'm hoping you've all read from cover to cover, but I'm sure most people have only had a chance to sort of dip into it. But hopefully we can tickle your taste buds to go back and have a more thorough examination. Next slide, please, Owen. Super. So what is UKWAS? Well, obviously it stands for the UK Woodland Assurance Standard. It's basically, it is a certification standard, as you all know. It's a bespoke audit protocol for sustainable forest management in the context of the UK. And it is what I like to call a critical piece of soft infrastructure for the forestry sector, the woodland owners and the forest products businesses, allowing them to verify that their products and their lands are managed and produced in a sustainable, in a responsible way. And that feeds all the way down through the wood stream, the wood chain, as you know. So we've had 4 editions so far. The first one was launched at the end of 1999, and we've had 3 revisions, and this is the 4th revision, and hopefully that will form UKWAS 5 in due course. So next slide, please. Yes, I think one of the things to stress about the UKWAS model is just how unique it is. There's no other country in the world that's managed to pull off something akin to this. So it's a standard which is used by both FSC and PFC, and there's a lot of advantages which I'll outline in a moment, but it's something I think in the UK we should be very proud of developing and even more importantly maintaining for such a long period. Next slide, please. So we'll just have a quick look at the basics of everything you need to know about UKWAS in one slide. The scope of the standard is the United Kingdom, so that's Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It doesn't include Isle of Man and the Channel Islands, although there has been some interest from the Isle of Man in perhaps joining. So the UKWAS itself is a certification standard. It's not a forestry certification scheme in the way that FSC is or PFC is. It's not a comprehensive forestry manual. It is an audit protocol to help people demonstrate that they're delivering responsible forestry in the field and the UK forestry standard. The steering group is the governing body for the UKWAS, and membership of that is open to organisations who represent various parts of the sector, whether it's economic, environmental or social. And this time we've had a new arrangement put in place whereby the steering group doesn't undertake the revision itself, but appoints as an independent standard setting group. So this is a very important change. We might touch on that a little bit more later, but that brings it into conformance with the requirements of the certification schemes. So the baseline, the starting point for UKWAS was at the international level, the Intergovernmental Pan-European Operational Level Guidelines, which I think were 1992, I can't remember, just off the top of my head. And those were the foundation as well for the UK forestry standard. So the governmental standard was based on the intergovernmental agreements. And then we have the 2 certification schemes, FSC and PFC, who have their own standards. So collectively, the intention within UKWAS is to bring all those strands together to produce a single certification standard which can be used to verify delivery of these international, UK national, devolved nation national, and the two certification scheme standards. So they're all brought together. When it comes to quality control, the working group and the steering group obviously develop a standard which they think will meet the various requirements, but they are subject, of course, to a very substantial degree of quality control, in that FSC has its approval process, PFC has its endorsement process. So once the draft standard, the new draft of the standard is prepared and approved by the steering group here in the UK, they are submitted to those through the national schemes that they're submitted for approval or endorsement. And quite often we do get a number of issues raised at that stage in the process, which have to be addressed before approval endorsement can be given. There's scope to go beyond baseline requirements and to fill gaps where considered necessary, and in many instances that is what has happened over the years. But hitherto, at least, the steering group has always taken the view that it should be an accessible mainstream standard, so not a niche standard akin to sort of organic agriculture. So that's the starting point for UKWAS. The next slide, please. Yeah, so some thoughts on why it works. Firstly, it's a unique model. It's based on good old-fashioned British principled pragmatism. The agreement to develop a standard in this way was hard fought, really. There was a lot of discussion, a lot of debate back in the 90s about the best way of doing this in the UK context, and it involved the building of a lot of mutual trust. So the ownership of the standard rests with the stakeholders, and all the decisions are based on consensus. So basically everyone has a veto. So this really helped to bring people to the table, because they were very worried, of course, that you know, if you have too much majority voting, they might find themselves disadvantaged. And the way it plays out in practice is that we very rarely have people exercising a veto, because the participants in the discussions are very good at finding a way through all sorts of quite knotty problems over the years. And we've never had a problem which we haven't been able to solve so far through good discussion. So FSC UK played a key role in initiating the original process. They brought this idea, FSC brought this idea to the UK, and it's really, I think, contributed to raising the bar in the UK for our forestry practice. PEFC UK came along a few years later, and they were able to endorse the existing UKWAS rather than reinvent the wheel. So it means that it is possible for woodland owners and for timber processors and for those people who supply the market all the way through to the retail level, can actually get their product certified to one or both of those two certification schemes, but only be certified once. It's a dual certificate. Well, you're technically certified twice, but this can be done in one single operation. And that is unique. So it's a real advantage for the sector in the UK that nobody else has managed to pull off. And there are different markets that require different certifications. So that helps build the economic resilience of the sector as well. And we have this enduring partnership between UKWAS and the two schemes, and we have concordats which enshrine that in practice. You can't read the nice little flow diagram, I don't think, on the right-hand side, but it basically takes you through the elements which I just described, really, of how you have the international schemes, you have the national schemes, you have UKWAS doing the standard setting, and then you have the schemes doing the certification and so on. So if you want to look at that, you can find it actually on our UKWAS website. Next, please, Owen. So just have a look at the review and revision process next. So again, next slide, please. So, as I said, the biggest change this time was having a working group which was independent of the steering group and standalone and would deliver its results to the steering group. And we have very, very good representation from the 3 different chambers. I'm particularly pleased this year that this time around that we've got much stronger representation from the social sector, and I think it's not just been in the UK, but I think it's quite often the case that it's more difficult. It's proved more difficult to get good representation from the social sector in the past than it has for the economic or environmental sector. So I act as the independent chair, so I chair the meetings, I help facilitate the outcomes, but I don't make the decisions. The working group itself makes the decisions about what should be done or not done. So there you have the representatives for each chamber. There's not a bias in favour of the economic chamber, but everyone was very keen to have a representative of the state-owned forestry sector. So we slotted Angus Mackey from Forestry and Land Scotland into that economic chamber as an extra person. And the 3 standard setting bodies in the UK, so that's the UK Forestry Standard, which is facilitated by Scottish Forestry now on behalf of the 4 UK nations, and then we have Owen and Alan representing the 2 certification schemes. Next, please, Owen. So basically, what we've had hitherto is, up to this point, is we've had a review, and this time we've made a much greater distinction between the review and the revision. I think it was always pretty well taken as a given that we would always move on to revision. So this time the steering group was very keen to differentiate clearly between the review and the revision. So the review is the process by which you decide whether or not the standard needs to be revised. So we start off with an evidence gathering phase. You have the various elements of the evidence gathering there. We have interpretation review, looking at anything that's come up from the current version of the standard, which has caused difficulty in interpretation. We look at new scientific and technical knowledge in the technical review. Standard users feedback, of course, is really important. The risk review is quite a considerable piece of work carried out by the 2 schemes. And we then have the certification schemes requirements reviews. Obviously, the certification schemes are continuously evolving, and new elements added. Things like IGIs were not on the field in the earlier versions of the standard, but have come into play in more recent years. So that's just one example of things that change and have to be accommodated. Next slide, please. So the conclusion of the review was that a revision is required. All the evidence that we just looked at in the previous slide was pulled together into an issues paper, which is available on the UKWAS website if you want to look at that. And in addition to those reviews we just looked at a moment ago, we also asked sort of informally wasn't a formal part of the process in the sense that this next consultation stage is, but we asked any stakeholders that wish to make input at the outset, so that that could help us shape the first shot at preparing a standard. So that was a very, very useful process. We had 19 sets of input from various stakeholders. So moving on to the next phase, the revision and consultation phases. So the ultimate aim here is that the working group shall prepare a draft, which we call a pre-approval draft of the standard, and to confirm to the steering group that there's been sufficient consultation, it's been sufficiently tested if necessary, and it meets the aims and objectives of the revision. And so they recommend that it be approved by the steering group. So we are at the phase now of having an initial revision draft. We had a lot of days of meetings to pull this together, and it was all on Zoom, of course, so it wasn't like being in the same room, but it worked extremely well, actually, and we developed a good esprit de corps, and it was a very constructive process. So the next stage is having the consultation period of 60 days. We're exactly halfway through the consultation period now. And then we'll look at all the evidence that is submitted, all the ideas that are submitted, and come up with a second revision draft. So what's in the initial revision draft is the first stab by the working group, and it should not be regarded as being their final word on what they think should be in the ultimate standard, but it's as far as we've got at this stage. And the second revision draft, we will start work on that later in the summer, and then that'll have another 60 days of consultation. Next slide, please. So basically, some milestones on the revision. Excuse me. The two phases we just talked about. Excuse me. So the second revision draft, we expect to have the consultation for that in October and November. And then we will the working group will do further work and turn that into a pre-approval draft, which should be remitted to the steering group of UKWAS by the end of May 2022 at the latest. We've built in plenty of slack time. In all likelihood, it will be sent to the steering group earlier than that. There is scope, if the working group consider it necessary, to have some additional consultation at a later stage, but we certainly haven't made any decisions to do that so far. Once the steering group is considered, approved, and hopefully not raised any issues, and remitted the scheme, the draft and pre-approval draft to certification schemes by the end of September, the certification schemes then take over and they prepare a version of the standard which includes various other scheme elements which are beyond the scope of the work of UKWAS, and then they remit these to the international offices for approval or endorsement. And the target is that the effective date for the UKWAS 5, effective date meaning the day that that comes into operation, would be the 1st of April 2023. Perhaps 1st of April isn't the best choice of dates, but there you go. And then, of course, we do have a transition period, so people have a year to get up to speed with the new version. Next, please. So I'm just going to talk you through now some of the highlights of the initial revision draft, and it's not meant to be in detail, and it's meant to give you a flavour of where we've got to and the sorts of things we're thinking about. Our early discussions were really trying to define the big issues, the major issues, any structural issues. Some of the major issues are often cross-cutting, so there's not one little section about that particular issue, but it's spread throughout the standard. So we had a lot of useful discussions on that. And the good news, if we go to the next slide, is that when it came to structural issues, you might recall that we had a major restructuring exercise in advance of publishing UKWAS 4. The 5 sections of the standard are laid out there. They've been very well received in the sector, and there was no one suggesting that we should make any changes to that major structure, which is good news because it makes it a lot easier for people to move from one standard to the other. What we have done is to retitle some of the subsections for greater clarity and or consistency with other sections of the standard. We've sometimes added new subsections, we've split subsections, reordered subsections, and elaborated and so on and so forth. But all of these things were done for greater clarity, greater consistency, and for a more thorough coverage of that particular topic. One interesting thing we have done is, and this is in response to an FSC recommendation, is to move from using the word shall in our requirements to saying it's something called the present indicative. I'm not even sure, having spoken to a friend who teaches English, he said he'd never heard of the present indicative, but it's not British terminology, but essentially, instead of saying I shall go to the supermarket tonight, you would say that doesn't work, that one, does it? In any way, instead of saying shall, you say is, basically. So instead of saying the woodland owner shall do something, you say that this condition is already reached. So the woodland is, or I'm not explaining this at all well, so I'm just going to move on because we all got confused about this tense. But it is actually the tense that we used in the original first edition of the UKWAS, and I think it is actually clearer. So I think it is actually a good move. I'm sorry for my complete failure to explain it. Next, please. This is actually the point where I discovered I've accidentally deleted a slide. So before I get on to other issues, I will tell you what was on the slide, which was on major issues. Because what we found were, what the working group identified were a number of major issues, all of which were cross-cutting. And they were some of the big challenges of our time that we've been hearing a lot about lately in the news and current affairs. So climate change, no surprise. The biodiversity crisis, so loss of biodiversity. The whole issue of forest resilience, whether it be economic resilience, environmental resilience, or social resilience. The enhancing of natural capital values of the woodlands, and the safeguarding of the provision of ecosystem services. So those are the big major issues. I'll find that slide and I'll send it to Owen so he can attach it, include it in the PDF that he circulates. So the way most of these things, most of those have been dealt with is actually not through introducing new sections, but through weaving into the draft relevant text to reflect them where it's necessary. So moving on to other issues, I'm just going to sort of highlight one or two of these as we go through perhaps, but it just gives you a flavour. I've focused in the ones that I've picked to really look at the ones where the requirements, so that is the compulsory elements of the standard, have been changed. We actually have two versions of the standard. So if you wish to have a quick look, there's a version which only has the requirements, and that gives you a quick flavour of where changes are. And then we've got the full version, which includes the guidance, which helps you interpret the standard and gives you some examples of the sorts of things you might wish to do to demonstrate that you're complying with the requirement, and also provides some examples of ways you might be able to verify that you're meeting the requirement. So there's a lot of changes which have taken place at guidance level in particular. There's been some additional verifiers, obviously, but I would say the bulk of the changed text is in the guidance, and that's there to be helpful. When it comes to the requirement level, there haven't been vast numbers of changes, but there are some significant changes. So I've just broken it down by sections. So there were no major changes really in the first section of the standard, but in the management planning, which is actually one of the most important sections of the standard, because it sets the scene for everything that you will be doing thereafter. So we started off with embedding into the management policy and objectives the whole concept of forest resilience, very upfront. We've identified the need to have an increased focus on cooperating with neighbouring landowners, and some examples of this in the discussions were talking about controlling wild mammals, controlling invasive species, tree seedlings growing on open land beyond the forest boundary, for example. An interesting one that's come up is about the average annual allowable cut. So a requirement that you need to be able to quantify and justify your annual allowable cut. So that's quite a tricky one. I think there's going to be some more discussion on that one. Soil carbon is explicitly included in how to maintain the woodland's productive potential. So that's up front there. We've retermed what in FSC parlance and I think PFC parlance are non-timber forest products. We had a different acronym for them, but we've changed it again. So they're now non-woodland forest products, as opposed to non-wood forest products. And the idea here is that some of these products can be specifically included in the scope of certification. So something like mushrooms or some of the other things we have on the list could be classed as certified through the certification program, not just the trees. So I think probably quite a lot of you are familiar with certification of venison, for example, but there's a longer list. And we are particularly keen to hear from people if they think there are some things missed off that list. But the thinking is that there has to be some method of judging whether the non-woodland forest product can actually be, there are some guidelines available somewhere to actually assess whether they have been managed in a responsible fashion. We've made a greater differentiation between existing woodlands and new woodlands, and this is more to do with clarity and so on than huge changes to the requirements that have to be considered, but we had quite a good discussion on that one. Another one which might set a few hairs running is that when it came to wild deer management, the very strong feeling of the working group was that only non-toxic ammunition, so non-lead ammunition, should be used in managing wild deer. We've heard a lot of news about plastics in recent years, and we did introduce that element of plastic pollution into the current version of UKWAS, and we've gone further. The working group has gone further this time, and is not only looking at minimising dealing with the waste from products like tree shelters, but also looking at requiring people to reduce the amount of, or think very carefully about the amount of plastic and this sort of thing that they introduce into the forest in the first place. So looking to minimise the environmental impacts of tree protection products. When it comes to converting land to non-woodland use, well, this was an interesting discussion. The requirement at the moment, as it's proposed, is that any land converted to non-woodland use shall not exceed 5% of the whole woodland management unit, nor should it destroy any areas of high carbon stock. So the particular discussions there particularly focused on areas where people are converting woodlands back to a non-woodland use, generally for environmental reasons, for example, in peat bogs. So there's a lot of discussion to be had on that one still, I'm sure. Short rotation coppice was something that was raised. You know, could you have a short rotation coppice certified or not? And the answer was that you could, but it would have to be done within the scope of meeting all the UKWAS requirements. So just having a field full of short rotation coppice is unlikely to be received favourably by an auditor. So it's basically been aligned with the requirements we already had for sort of commercial Christmas tree production. Next, please, Owen.
Just while I move on the slide, Peter, just to point out that we've had 40 minutes now, so if we could move reasonably quickly to the question and answers, that would be great.
Okay. So I think most of the issues were in management planning. When it came to operations, we've got a greater focus on carbon. We've beefed up the section on historic environment sites. There's a new requirement on operational biosecurity. Stump harvesting is not permitted, not to be confused with removing of stumps for other reasons as opposed to harvesting for commercial ends. The section on ground preparation restocking has been adapted to deal with the issue of carbon loss, soil carbon loss, with explicit inclusion of forest visitor infrastructure and issues to be dealt with there. The pesticide section is more thought has been given to that, so any ideas people have on that would be helpful. Fertilizers have been added to the list of things that should be avoiding environmental damage. That's already the case for pesticides or biological control agents. And looking at a risk assessment process for pest control options has come in, and issues on fencing design and so on. And as I said before, requirements to reduce, to minimize waste and reduce the number of materials required to be used in the forest. Next, please. Section 4, which is about natural, historical and cultural environment. Basically, I think there's a lot of enhanced text on the ASNWs, ancient semi-natural woodlands, the PAWS, plantations and ancient woodland sites, and on managing semi-natural woodlands. An important change is the minimum area of a WMU, the Woodland Management Unit, to comprise semi-natural habitat is being raised from 5% to 10%, and a preference for natural regeneration to be introduced in ancient and semi-natural woodlands. Subsection on historic environment has been beefed up. When it comes to game and so on, a bit of a rejig there, and use of non-toxic ammunition in all shooting activities, so lead shot basically, to be prohibited. Section 5, not very many changes. Next one, please, Owen. We've elaborated text on public access and so on training and continuing development. We're giving more thought to workers' rights and health and safety. And next, please. We're looking for some specific feedback on those particular 4 subsections there. So it's the use of non-toxic lead ammunition, non-lead ammunition. It's the whether we've got all the non-wood forest products explicitly included within the scope of the standard, and then health and safety and workers' rights issues. So next slide, please. That is a quick roundup. Sorry for overrunning and sorry for croaking, but thank you for listening. And over to Owen to be our question master.
Thanks very much, Peter. That is terrific. Well, everyone, I hope that's been a big help, especially for those of you who aren't familiar with the UKWAS process and the relationship between UKWAS, FSC, and PEFC. Hopefully, that's made everything a bit clearer. So it's over to you now, basically, to ask your questions, and we will do our best to answer them. I can see that some people have already typed their questions in. I'm going to ask my colleague Beth in a moment to start reading those out in order, and then we'll see who is best placed to respond to them. I'm just going to unmute Alan Watkins from PEFC and Andy Sharkey from the Woodland Trust. Hopefully you can then mute yourselves again if necessary, but just in case you're able to contribute any answers. And I believe my colleague Rachel should have stopped the recording now, so we can all speak freely without any fear of repercussions.